terms of studying. But generally, when you're trying to read sources, and probably you read sources that are mostly written in Arabic, because most of the people that you wrote about published their scholar work in Arabic, and some, even Mahmoud of Qajar, right? He wrote essentially a dictionary of Turkic language to Arabic. There might be reasons why he wrote it, like in your book you argue about it, but again, his main audience was somewhere in Baghdad or somewhere in the Middle East.
However, you have to keep in mind that there's been 100 years of really serious scholarship. This isn't scholarship that average person learns about. These are the real hardcore scholars. For example, you mentioned Mahmoud of Kashgar. There was a man, an American, who worked at the University of Chicago for many years, who did a unbelievable, have a very specific.
Is that basically you're saying to the world, you're saying there is this place called Central Asia.
I studied Uzbek very hard, and exactly right, exactly right. They invented this trade network, and different religions were still there.
Right now in Uzbekistan, people talk about this quite seriously.
They were spreading Central Asian culture, and open the windows in every direction.
Yeah.
Mr. Mirziyoyev's formula.
And I understand that in Central Asia you have to play by certain rules.
Stimulated the mind. He lost his krisha, he lost his amazing sign of success if you're being criticized from both sides.
Hi everyone, this is Hoshimov Economics and I'm Behzad. Our guest today is Frederick Starr. Professor Starr is, I would say, the most important figure in Central Asian studies right now in the United States. And welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
I'll start right away. I guess my first question would be about your book, the book that you recently published, Lost Enlightenment. I read your book before we met, and
in English or Uzbek?
In English. I actually didn't know that there is an Uzbek translation. I found a Kazakh one, and I just recently learned that it is actually translated to Uzbek. As a historian, as somebody who did not study Central Asian region in grad school or even before, but you came to this idea pretty late. You said in '96 or something you started to think about it. How did you study the region? Like, how did you start studying? How does it happen that you can study a region that is so complicated in terms of religion, in terms of geography, in terms of economics?
I have to go back to early biography. I started my career in archaeology, and I worked for several years in doing archaeological work in Turkey, mapping ancient roads. And that, at a certain point, I was working down on the Turkish-Syrian border. It became rather dangerous, and I decided it wasn't really good for my health. I was traveling all over the place, in a little Jeep and talking to all the old men at Village Springs. And I decided at that point, because the Soviet Union was a big presence in our life in the West, to shift toward Russian and Soviet studies, and did that and started the Kennan Institute here in town, which is still thriving. But then, after the collapse of the USSR, I realized that there were new countries that we had to know about, and we didn't know about them. And the reason we didn't know is that, frankly, books, for example, published in Uzbekistan didn't get to the United States, didn't get abroad, because they only the books that Moscow wanted got abroad. And this was true in other fields too. So I realized after the collapse of the USSR that we needed to really learn about a lot of regions, new countries, that we hadn't studied closely. And that's when I decided to establish the Central Asia Caucasus Institute here in Washington, and that was 25 years ago, and it's thriving today. So Uzbek and I traveled everywhere, and then I got involved in planning some universities in the region, and I serve as a trustee of 2 of them today. But in that process, I had to go everywhere.
Just mechanically, like, how do you think about learning a new culture or new studies? Like,
you just do it. But to put it more,
what's your algorithm? Let's say I'm a student of some area. Let's put it Central Asia. I'm American.
Yes.
Let's say.
Yes.
And I want to study Central Asia. I never been there. You know, I was born in Vermont.
Yes.
Or something. And I want to study it. Like, how would you tell me how to study?
Well, I would say, first of all, go there. Okay. Unless you have a very specific, concrete knowledge of the place, and not just the capital. Travel around, take your time, take months, and you know, I've traveled all over Central Asia and Afghanistan too, and this is, you must be there. That's first. Second, you must have access to languages. You must. I studied Uzbek very hard, and unless I've had a fairly generous amount of Uzbek vodka today, I don't speak it publicly. I'm afraid I've allowed it to decay a bit, but I did study it hard, and languages are important. I had Russian. My wife is German, so I have a very specific.
Is that basically you're saying to the world, you're saying there is this place called Central Asia.
I studied Uzbek very hard, and exactly right, okay. Exactly right. They invented this trade network, and different religions were still there.
Right now in Uzbekistan, people talk about this quite seriously.
They were spreading Central Asian culture, and open the windows in every direction.
Yeah.
Mr. Mirziyoyev's formula.
And I understand that in Central Asia you have to play by certain rules.
Stimulated the mind. He lost his krisha, he lost his amazing sign of success if you're being criticized from both sides.
Hi everyone, this is Hoshimov Economics and I'm Behzad. Our guest today is Frederick Starr. Professor Starr is, I would say, the most important figure in Central Asian studies right now in the United States. And welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
I'll start right away. I guess my first question would be about your book, the book that you recently published, Lost Enlightenment. I read your book before we met, and
in English or Uzbek?
In English. I actually didn't know that there is an Uzbek translation. I found a Kazakh one, and I just recently learned that it is actually translated to Uzbek. As a historian, as somebody who did not study Central Asian region in grad school or even before, but you came to this idea pretty late. You said in '96 or something you started to think about it. How did you study the region? Like, how did you start studying? How does it happen that you can study a region that is so complicated in terms of religion, in terms of geography, in terms of economics?
I have to go back to early biography. I started my career in archaeology, and I worked for several years in doing archaeological work in Turkey, mapping ancient roads. And that, at a certain point, I was working down on the Turkish-Syrian border. It became rather dangerous, and I decided it wasn't really good for my health. I was traveling all over the place, in a little Jeep and talking to all the old men at Village Springs. And I decided at that point, because the Soviet Union was a big presence in our life in the West, to shift toward Russian and Soviet studies, and did that and started the Kennan Institute here in town, which is still thriving. But then, after the collapse of the USSR, I realized that there were new countries that we had to know about. And we didn't know about them. And the reason we didn't know is that, frankly, books, for example, published in Uzbekistan didn't get to the United States, didn't get abroad, because they only the books that Moscow wanted got abroad. And this was true in other fields too. So I realized after the collapse of the USSR that we needed to really learn about a lot of regions, new countries, that we hadn't studied closely. And that's when I decided to establish the Central Asia Caucasus Institute here in Washington, which that was 25 years ago, and it's thriving today. So because of my Turkish background, I was able to read fairly easily, to read my way into Uzbek, and I traveled everywhere, and then I got involved in planning some universities in the region, and I serve as a trustee of 2 of them today. But in that process, I had to go everywhere.
Just mechanically, like, how do you think about learning a new culture or new studies? Like,
you just do it. But to put it more,
what's your algorithm? Let's say I'm a student of some area. Let's put it Central Asia. I'm American.
Yes.
Let's say.
Yes.
And I want to study Central Asia. I never been there. You know, I was born in Vermont.
Yes.
Or something. And I want to study it. Like, how would you tell me how to study?
Well, I would say, first of all, go there. Okay. Unless you have a very specific, concrete knowledge of the place, and not just the capital. Travel around, take your time, take months. And you know, I've traveled all over Central Asia and Afghanistan too. And this is, you must be there. That's first. Second, you must have access to languages. You must. I studied Uzbek very hard, and unless I've had a fairly generous amount of Uzbek vodka today, I don't speak it publicly. I'm afraid I've allowed it to decay a bit, but I did study it hard, and languages are important. I had Russian. My wife is German, so I had access to information from a lot of different sources. But the main thing, I think, is 2 things: language and being there.
Let's say I go there.
Yes.
And then I want to study the history of the land that was 1,000 years ago, like you did for your book,
yes.
Right? So people who live there right now don't speak the language, probably are in a different period, like historically. It's just like going to a place where it's not like a descendant, like you can't really name this guy being grandson of Al-Khwarizmi, right? I mean, it may be a different group of people. You know, there was a Mongolian invasion, there was a lot of things that happened at that time, but like, you know,
they're not the same people.
They may or may not be. I'm not a historian to make that claim, but what I'm trying to say is that in terms of, like, let's say there are civilizations in this world, and right now there are countries there, but those civilizations, the countries that are there, or national countries, or even ethnicities or languages, are absolutely orthogonal to the people who lived there before. So in that sense, how do you do it? Like, most of your sources are Persian, they're not Uzbek. Like, what did you study Uzbek?
Well, they're Persianate.
Okay.
Not, but many are Turkic too.
I know, like Kashgari or somebody like that, like probably Farabi or something.
Farabi was probably Persianate,
okay,
almost certainly. However, you have Mahmud of Kashgar, you have Yusuf of Balasagun, those were Turkic.
Okay.
Big figures. But it's very interesting. There is one group in Central Asia today who are lineal descendants from an ancient group, and that's in Yakhnob in Tajikistan's very high valley, where they are the lineal descendants of the ancient Sogdians from the Zarafshan Valley. Imagine.
Not Bactrians?
No. Sogdians. And they even have preserved parts of the fragments of the Sogdian language. But you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
I'm not
These
sure
aren't
was
the
helpful.
same.
Yeah.
And it's a long distance. But on the other hand, getting a tactile sense of the geography is very important. It's very important to understand, for example, take Samarkand. Okay. Samarkand, we think of tourists go boom, they go right to, there they are, Bibi Hanum and so on. They don't realize that it was a whole big oasis, that there were many towns within this oasis. There were walls around this oasis. This was a micro civilization right there. And the same was true, of course, in Bukhara or Merv or Balkh or whatever. And just to appreciate that these were complex centers with all kinds of industries and activities, just to see that on the ground today and to appreciate that it's not just that little city that you're talking about.
I agree with you that probably going there might help on margins in terms of studying. But generally, when you're trying to read sources, and probably you read sources that are mostly written in Arabic, because most of the people that you wrote about published their scholar work in Arabic, and some, even Mahmoud of Qajar, right? He wrote essentially a dictionary of Turkic language to Arabic. There might be reasons why he wrote it, like in your book you argue about it, but again, his main audience was somewhere in Baghdad or somewhere in the Middle East.
However, you have to keep in mind that there's been 100 years of really serious scholarship. This isn't scholarship that average person learns about. These are the real hardcore scholars. For example, you mentioned Mahmud of Kashgar. There was a man, an American, who worked at the University of Chicago for many years, who did an unbelievable edition of Kashgari's book about Turkic languages. He analyzed every aspect of it. He did a beautiful translation into English. There are translations into German, into Russian, French. All these, a century of scholarship was at my disposal.
Okay. So let us talk about the book, not the process.
Yes.
Right? So I read your book probably as an average and layperson reader. So I'm not a historian, and I probably am not very familiar with the methods that historians use. Two things I noticed about the book is like it reads as a narration. It reads like a story. Like you start with correspondence of two people and then how this changed. But the main message of the book that I understood, which I may be wrong, and I really want you to talk me out if I'm wrong. If I'm not wrong, I want you to say, is that basically you're saying to the world, you're saying there is this place called Central Asia, which we now probably regard as a backwater of the world. Like nothing really important happens there, as far as the world is concerned, and probably nothing very important happened there too, like what the world thinks, because now nothing is happening. But you're saying there was a time between 8th and 12th century or 13th, whatever people use, in which this place was probably the most important place in the world map in terms of intellectual production, and not only intellectual but general. It was a place to be. It was like a New York of its time or something. I'm not sure New York is New York now, but so this was your message. And then in the book you said, but for some reason, which I'll tell what the reason is that I understood, they lost it now. And to understand them, you're saying we have to understand that golden age. Am I right or wrong?
Exactly right.
Okay.
Exactly right.
Okay.
And by the way, writing this book, I was not interested. I wanted it to be read by the top scholars, but I also wanted it to be read by people exactly like you, highly educated people in many different fields.
Okay. Let me take my economist hat and ask you this question. In economics, like you historians don't like us because you call it determinism, right? Like we always think about events in terms of what was a reason behind it, but not necessarily a person behind it.
Yes.
So deterministically, I want to ask you first question, like, why Central Asia? In your book, you try to make a case that it was trade, it was trading routes, there was like a lot of things going on, they were close to China, close to India, close to the Middle East, and they were in the middle of this melting pot, if you will.
The only ones in the middle.
But hear me out. Why it didn't happen in the Middle East? Meaning, Middle East could use Central Asia, they could use China, they could use India. Like, why? What was special about Middle East? Because they were basically the same country politically, right?
Not really.
But I mean, it was like almost like a one, like from I don't know, from Western Xinjiang to like almost all Khorasan was one, and then Baghdad was very close to it in terms of, again, politics. But why, it didn't happen in Syria or
I take a very economist approach to this issue.
Okay.
First of all, these were rich and successful because of trade and because of manufacturing. These were not passive traders. They were actually producing huge amounts of goods that were being exported in every direction. We forget that. We forget that they invented this trade network. That wasn't done by the Chinese or the Europeans or the Arabs or the Indians.
But again, why the trade? Like you're saying, as a consequence, is not a
location really is important. Okay. And the Arabs didn't do this because they had their brief flowering, but it didn't attain the high level that was achieved in Central Asia, and it wasn't sustained. Why? Because I think the interaction between open-minded contact with the world and the economic contact is very important. For example, Central Asian, deep underneath the soil is a layer of Zoroastrianism, which was invented there, created there as a kind of archetypal religion.
Yeah.
Then Buddhism and the Greek gods and Judaism and Christianity and many flavors of Islam. This was a very rich, complex place. And the very complexity, all these threads feeding in, stimulated the mind. And that is something that is as important as the economics.
How much in this equation was importance of Arabs' conquest of Central Asia? Meaning most of it happened after Central Asia became both under caliphate and became Muslim. So most of the people were second or third generation converts.
And many weren't Muslims.
Probably not.
And
not openly Muslim. You are arguing in the book that some of them were very devout Muslims, and some of them were probably more like I wouldn't call liberal, but let's put it this way, like liberal Muslims, those who did it not for religion but for pecuniary benefits.
Let me take it from the other side.
Okay.
The Arabs destroyed much culture in Central Asia. Yeah. Khwarezm, for example, had its own language, its own literature, its own books, gone.
Yeah.
And this is true for, the texts of Zoroastrianism, gone. And I think what they did bring was a common language, which is very important, playing the role of Latin in the West. That was very important. But I think you underestimate how much was there before. If I were to write a criticism of my book, I would say you should have started much earlier and explained the riches intellectually and culturally and economically pre this golden age.
No, so let me take that sense and say, all right, most of whatever happened in the Golden Age was not due to the conquest of Arabs or Islam, but it was before that.
Because of the rich
would you
heritage.
agree to that
yes,
statement?
because of the rich
So,
heritage.
If that's true, why didn't it happen before Arabs' conquest? Meaning, why Central Asia didn't have their golden age from 3rd century to 6th, but they had, like, you know, right after they were part of the caliphate? Like,
again, I have to remind you that all the great writers of Central Asia, none of them are known to us except through maybe 10% of what they wrote. The rest is gone, lost. Now, before this golden age about which I wrote, there were also important writers. We don't know them. Their works have disappeared. I touch on a few that we know have fragments of, but the loss, the cultural destruction that occurred is very important, and this did not come out of a barren soil. This came out of a rich and deep culture, which my dear friend Mr. Tveladze has devoted his life to studying, the pre-Muslim era. Now, what happened in the Muslim era is that these were very open-minded and tolerant people, and there were people who, as you say, were very pious. There were people who were less pious. There were people who were completely secular, and there were people who were anti-religion. They all were there, and they were all interacting. And different religions were still there. Don't forget.
I agree with you in terms of like them being tolerant about religions. What I was trying to get you at was more like to grapple with these two questions. First is that why they were flourishing because they were part of this like larger empire? Was it the reason?
No, I think the larger empire was flourishing as much because of them.
No,
and don't forget, they took over. The Abbasid Empire was
after Harun al-Rashid's death, right?
Yes, they took over. They
lived in Merv, and then they
yes, exactly. People don't point this out. They never point this out. They think of Baghdad as solely a Middle Eastern and Arab phenomenon. It wasn't.
So I want you really to tell me or to explain to me this thing. So Central Asia was part of the Abbasids, and I would assume, again as an economist, not as a historian, that because they were part of the Abbasid Empire and because trade routes were protected by, say, the government that was in Baghdad at that time, and then basically area from like West China till Lebanon or something like that were almost like one country. So trade, there was low tariffs and so on and so forth, and therefore being in part of like a bigger economy, those people could scale their businesses. Their goods were sold in Damascus and Baghdad and anywhere they want. But if it wasn't for an Arab conquest, like the question again is why didn't it happen before Arab conquest? And my opinion was maybe because it wasn't a part of the larger empire.
Well, let me agree with you partly that certainly this was a factor, as was the fact that they were so close to India, so close and accessible to China. India is, I mean, look on the map. India, Lahore, a great capital, is really almost culturally part of Central Asia. So, but your point is right. The Abbasids did help, but who protected those trade routes? It was the Turkic guys in the countryside. And those were done because they had a reciprocal arrangement not with Baghdad, but with these great urban centers. They were mutually dependent. The Turkic nomads were they were producing all kinds of goods in addition to horses. They were producing masses of goods which they sold in the great urban centers. The urban centers found a market among the nomads and the Turks. So this didn't require, and it didn't ever get trade support from Baghdad, from the Abbasids. Even the currency. When the Abbasids produced their currency, the locals in Central Asia produced their own, or they changed it so that their stamp was on it.
Yeah, but I mean, all the currencies were gold, so we didn't have a fiat currency at that time. But I guess my question is like, why it didn't happen in Baghdad? So if all the recipes are in there, but like,
what I'm suggesting here is that Baghdad itself, which was designed and constructed largely by people from Central Asia, and then with the Abbasid rule was totally dependent on Central Asian Turks. The entire military was. And they were completely. And how many of these great intellectual figures whom we say, oh, he was, Farabi, Khwarizmi, all these people. Well, of course, they may have been in Baghdad for a while, but they were they were spreading Central Asian culture, just as later they spread it to China and certainly spread it to India. There is still to this day, there are Ibn Sina hospitals in India that depend on his tradition of medicine. So what I'm suggesting is that the dynamic element in the Eurasia at that period, for several hundred years, came from this very fertile, intellectually, economically fertile region of Central Asia. And what we think of as the center further to the west wasn't.
Okay, let's say I buy this. One question I want to ask is like, why do you call it lost Enlightenment but not lost, say, I don't know, Renaissance?
I think there was much more deep continuity in cultural, intellectual continuity in Central Asia than we have yet recognized. Give you an example. I would love to read a book that examines how traditions of Buddhism ended up appearing in a new renaissance, if you will, in Sufism. Go to Termez. The two were like this. I think there was more continuity than we realized.
So that's why the name Renaissance wouldn't do the justice.
So it's not Renaissance implies that something died and came back.
No, but what I'm saying in terms of the world map of intellectualism, right? So the cradle was probably somewhere in the Middle East, then it went to Greek towns and cities, I would say. Then like Plato and Aristotle. And afterwards, pretty much the world was, silent in terms of science, and basically books that Khwarizmi or Avicenna read were Greek philosophy, Greek logic, and
Greek science.
Greek science, basically.
And how did they know them? Because
Arabs brought it.
Because Syrian Christians.
Arabs.
They're ethnically Arabs, but they're Syrian Christians who happen to know both
Greek and Arabic.
It was and they why were they bringing this knowledge to Central Asia? Because they were all over Central Asia. They were very active, all the way down to India, by the way. To this day, there are Syrian Christians in India. So
Syrian Christians basically lived in the Eastern Byzantine Empire, right? Like
no, they lived in every city in Central Asia.
No,
too.
I'm saying like how they came from Syria to Central Asia, because they were part of Eastern Roman Empire, and then when Arabs came, it was part of one big country. That's why they were able to move freely, relatively freely within one country, and then they brought the works, and Central Asian scholars were able to read them in Arabic.
I don't think that the Abbasid rule was a country in the sense that you use the term, and repeatedly use the term.
So how should I use it?
I think it was a method of collecting taxes and spending them. The
definition of the republic?
And spending them on an army to fight external enemies.
But I mean, as we know, a country or a state usually defined as a place where you have postal services and an army, right? I mean, what's the second thing that was missing from Abbasid Empire that you think that doesn't make them a country?
I think my impression is that it was a relatively thin, all empires were relatively thin compared with what we think of today. And by comparison, these, if you will, city-states of Central Asia, these great oasis-based centers, were relatively much more important than we think today. This hasn't been studied adequately. There is a lot of evidence on this, but these cities, whether it's Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, Balkh, you name it, and 50 others, these were very sophisticated places that had a solid economic base.
Like federalism, like they were.
It's a kind of yes. They had to have. My prosperity depends on good relations with you, my neighbor. Maybe it's 3 days away, but therefore there were understandings that developed which haven't been studied. There was, I like your term, federalism, but it wasn't formalized that way.
No, I mean, like, if you look at the U.S. history too, by like 19th century, for example, like federal taxes were less than like 5% of the GDP of the United States.
Yes,
which means like
decentralized,
very decentralized. So they were partly like that. Like, so maybe 2 or 3% of the economy were collected by taxes, but the rest were pretty much federalized.
And I think your point is I like the term federalized, but
like divided into
the rule of this great Central Asian culture was highly didn't require a big boss. There were big bosses like Mahmud of Ghazni who appeared, but they didn't help particularly. Okay. It didn't require them because there were so many practical understandings between the leaders, business leaders, and others of the and political leaders of these great urban centers.
So basically, the recipe is the following: if you have free trade, low tariffs, more or less adequate level of security, and more or less tolerance to way people believe and open-mindedness towards thinking.
And open the windows in every direction.
Yeah, then you probably will get innovation.
This sounds like Mr. Mirziyoyev's formula.
Let me think about it as innovations as we know it currently. So the current centers of the innovations in the world are probably like Silicon Valley. There are places that are struggling with it. I mean, probably the second best place is probably somewhere around Tel Aviv in Israel. Other places in the world more or less are doing it, but they're way behind modern Silicon Valley. And people really try to study what's going on. And the current literature of innovation and technology tells us that clusters or like big cities are really important. So there's a Harvard economist named Edward Glaser, I guess, I don't know. He has a book called Triumph of the City, but more or less he has a lot of work on clusters and how one industry or one type of pursuit will help others. And if we measure by that margin, Central Asia is basically not doing that. It was pretty autarkic. Like if you look at average tariff size in Uzbekistan, it's probably very high because it's not part of the
We're
WTO.
in modern Central Asia now.
Modern Central Asia,
yes. Autarkic, absolutely.
Yeah, very autarkic. But then it was autarkic not only in 1996. It was pretty autarkic in 1596 too. So like
in 1596, but not 1096.
Not 1096. So what I guess why I'm trying to tell you this is to hear the following story. In your book, you basically say a name of the person who basically was responsible for the demise of that. And I find it not very adequate of an explanation for people like me in terms of saying, we'll talk about him later, like in a minute, but like I'm saying, if the recipe of growth is the following: trade, openness, and so on and so forth, why the recipe of the demise is not doing the opposite? So meaning, they were pretty open when they started decline. And you argue very fervently, I would say, that it wasn't Mongol invasion that made them made them go down. They were pretty weak already when Mongols came in.
I think you're absolutely right to emphasize, to distinguish between different kinds of decline and different kinds of flowering. Intellectual flowering can have various types of its own. There is that which is focused on science, mathematics, abstract thinking, that which is focused on art and other forms of culture. Then on the other side, you have the economic prosperity. The world is full today of areas that are extremely prosperous economically, and it linked, integrated, you name it, but which are not producing significant intellectual products.
So wait, you're saying there are places in the world that are rich, but they're not producing technology, the new technology?
I mean intellectual production in several such centers is far less than the level of the economy would.
Can you give an example?
I think this is true in large parts of the Gulf, for example. Super rich.
Oh, I get it. But yeah, most of the wealth comes from the oil.
Not the only one.
I mean, most of their wealth comes from the oil, right? Yeah, but other than that, most of the wealth in the world.
But I think, look, there are very few moments in civilization where economic prosperity and intellectual prosperity coincide. The Roman Empire produced extraordinary achievements in many areas, especially law, by the way. But it did not produce scientific achievements on the level of what the Greeks had done. The Greeks were so far ahead of that.
I would argue it. Like, I think Greeks are scientists and Romans are engineers. I mean, in terms of like civil engineering, and in terms of roads, and in terms of water, in terms of a lot of things that makes people's life better, Romans did a tremendous job.
They did, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it was not the same type of intellectual flowering that is our focus here.
Okay, let me buy this.
Abstract thinking.
I get it. You're saying basically, if you can produce treatises of logic or trigonometry or mathematics or chemistry or thinking about philosophy of science or whatever, this is very important. And Central Asians actually thrived in that, like they did poetry, everything. So I want to hear your short version of why the decline happened. I mean, I read your book obviously, and I know what you say, but like maybe I didn't get it. Like let me hear what you think.
Well, first of all, I agree with you entirely. The economic decline actually was slower, and
Yes.
and unquestionably, the hit from the Mongols affected that. Although to an amazing degree they did recover economically, but not in the same degree of dynamism.
Yeah.
I would say that the decline, first of all, we don't need to explain it because they were being intellectually highly productive for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So, nothing lasts forever. So let's not start blaming them. But I think the biggest reason was that the conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims created an environment of intellectual combat, and this kind of abstract thinking, which produced such phenomenal results in Central Asia, came under attack. And because, well, I of course speak of specific writers and thinkers, but I think the bigger part is that the conflict of Sunni and Shia, which was reflected in the conflict between Sunni Baghdad and Shia Cairo, these two competing caliphates.
Khorasan was almost homogeneously Sunni, right?
Yes.
So why is it a conflict that made it
But
decline?
the conflict meant that on the Sunni side, they were saying this speculative stuff is irrelevant and not germane to the most important issues of life. Their argument was a very fundamentalist one, namely that all life's questions can be resolved by texts from the Holy Quran and from the Hadiths.
So you're telling the Al-Ghazali's argument.
He eventually came to that. Now, various people have asked me, why are you so hostile to Ghazali? And I'm not, because later on in his life, after this episode as a younger man in Baghdad, he lost his krisha, he lost his political protection.
So you know important words in Central Asia, krisha, right?
He lost his krisha, he really did. Yeah. And then he focused on faith. And what Ghazali wrote about faith is important for all religions, highly respected in the Christian and Jewish worlds as well. But early along, he did terrible things, and that is he frontally attacked all of the kind of learning that I'm...
So here I kind of disagree, and I kind of did some homework on that, right? So there is this book that he basically, I think it's called Tahallutuf al-Falsifa. So meaning essentially the problems of, or like troubles, or refutation of the philosophers. Before that, he had a book called Maqsad al-Falsifa. So in that book that Ghazali wrote, he talks basically about Avicennian logic. The logic, so Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, as commonly known to our probably listeners, was very Aristotelian in his logic, right? Was very...
And suspected of being very Shia. Let me put it this way. Free intellectual inquiry got caught in the conflict between two caliphates, one of which happened to be Sunni, the other happened to be Shia. And this was and got caught in between. Ghazali's role was to be the voice of one of these at a key moment. Now, interestingly, I mean, the relative moderation of a lot of Central Asian thought, which, the Hanafi tradition and so on, it's relatively more moderate, would have allowed this to continue. But eventually, though, the development which you rightly have underscored, namely the eventual waning of these great land routes to the east, this knocked the economic base out from under it. And so, but I want to repeat what I said earlier. We are talking about this as if we're mourning someone who died early, died too young. But in fact, this flowering that I wrote about did last for hundreds of years, and in a bit of criticism of my own work, had we more documents, we could probably trace it earlier too. So let's not worry about blaming the causes.
Okay, let's say I buy it, but I think a lot of things that are well grounded are fairly sustainable. I would say
this was sustained for 500 years.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
So let us speak a little bit about Fred Starr, a professor, right? Like how'd you came about this? So I looked through your biography, and you did history at Princeton, and then you studied
classics, Latin and Greek.
Oh wow, okay. This part I didn't know, but you wrote a book on decentralization in Russia in 19th century. So basically before Alexander II, right? So
under Alexander, yes,
just before Alexander II. So it's like not
under Nicholas. It really flourished under Alexander. Yeah.
So, but before the cancellation of this law, it's Kripasnoye Pravo.
Before Alexander III.
Yeah. So, and then, so you wrote about this, which is an important topic. You know, there was like after Napoleonic Wars in Russia and yada yada. Like, what do you? Why did you think about this at all? Like, what?
Very simple. My life has been lived above all in the Midwest and the South, not on the East Coast, not on the West Coast.
So you're not from coastal elites.
And we, well, whether elite or non-elite or self-designated elites, I think is a better term, by the way. But because of this, I never expected look to Washington for solutions to life's problems. We never just didn't think this way, you know. The decentralization is the very core of our Constitution, it seems to me, giving so much authority to the states and so forth, and that local solutions are always better than things invented far away. I therefore was curious. You know, everyone said, well, the Russian tradition is of czarist centralization. I said, well, is there another tradition there? It turns out, yes, there was. And that's what I wrote about.
Okay. But, I mean, Russia isn't a natural place of decentralization. It's probably one of the most centralized, you know, regimes in the last 600 years, I guess. Like, it's really hard to find a place that was as centralized as Russia. And by the way, I'm not saying, you know, Soviet Union. I'm not saying current Russian Federation. I'm talking about
the whole thing.
The whole thing.
Yeah, I'm with you.
From like Mongols.
I'm not arguing.
And then, like, isn't it very curious to study the decentralization of the country?
But it was a very important strand in their thinking. Their whole legal thought in the 19th century went in this direction.
Okay.
Even the people whom Mr. Gorbachev studied in law school. This is the song they were singing. So it's there, but under the surface.
So what do you think of a New Deal and then, you know, increase of, you know, federal government?
I think I think we have much too much federal government today. I think Washington should.
No, but like New Deal, like Roosevelt.
Well, but that started then, and I think we've gone too far in the direction of centralization, too much bureaucracy, too much Washington. We need more local rule. And by the way, this takes us back to what we were discussing in Central Asia. I even though there was not a big governmental structure, these city-states, they're not quite city-states, we need a better term, but they managed to solve the most important economic and political problems and security problems.
What do you think of government investment in finance, sorry, not in finance, but like government financing innovations in technology? Like, is it important?
Oh, I think it is important, and I mean, after all, governments control currency. They have a fundamental role in all key financial transactions. That goes without saying.
No,
in the modern world.
What do you think of government financing the innovations, scientists?
It's been very positive, but on the other hand, it's not the sole source of innovation. It shouldn't be the sole source of support or innovation.
So let's talk about
because governments are subject to their own politics.
So let me talk a little brief, I guess, about 20th century architecture of the Soviet Union. You wrote a book on that. What's up with it? Like, how? Like, what fascinates me was that the how orthogonal the topics that you write about, like decentralization in Russia before Alexander III, then Soviet architecture, then Soviet jazz, and then, you know, centralization in 11th century. Like, how do you think about it?
My interest in architecture has other sources, but I was intrigued by the fact that in the 1920s and early 30s there existed in the Soviet Union a very innovative current in architecture, and it was usually thought to have come from so-called constructivist group, who ideologically were way over close to the communists. There was also another group led by Konstantin Stepanovich Melnikov, a great innovator whose home is now a museum in Moscow. They finally embraced him after persecuting him throughout his entire life. But this other group was the same kind of free-thinking, imaginative mixing of philosophy and architecture, which I found later among the Central Asian thinkers.
Okay, yeah, interesting. So it's like a polymath thing.
And another, yes, and another aspect of it is important, and that is that I was interested both in the architecture and in jazz with currents in Soviet life that existed in spite of rather than because of the state.
Okay.
And I it's not a book about very much a book about jazz, but it's really about the inability of the highly centralized, ruthless Soviet state to control people's values and people's taste.
Okay. Let's talk about modern Russia. You have this report on Putin's grand strategy in Central Asia and Eurasia more generally, and Eurasian Union. Right now in Uzbekistan, people talk about this quite seriously, right? They are basically discussing that. And in your report that you wrote, I think, with your institute, you basically are not very positive about that. Can you elaborate?
Well, look, if the idea is to create a real trade zone like the EU, it's failed, because trade within the region reached a peak in 2012 and it's never come back to it. It's just the Eurasian Economic Union looks to, I think, any fair-minded observer as a kind of Trojan horse for Russia to export its goods to a protected market.
So it's like USSR 2.0?
Well, it has, I mean, statistically, that's what it's been so far. Maybe it'll change. Maybe in a post-Putin era it'll be different. But so far it's been Russia exporting goods to these small countries. And how can it be otherwise when you have a so-called economic union that is totally dominated not only in size but in power by one member?
Russia question. Who is more underrated Prime Minister of Russia, Stolypin or Gaidar?
That's a hard question. I would say Stolypin.
He's more underrated.
More underrated.
I mean, like...
What do you think?
I think it's Gaidar.
That's an interesting... I can see your point. It's a clever... and it's an important insight. Bravo. Okay. Interesting.
So you are with me?
Yeah, I think I would give you, yeah.
Because I mean, Stolypin was killed, but Gaidar wasn't. But it doesn't mean, I mean, or he was. I don't know. So let me finish with a very, very dismal question. Not nice. Harper's Magazine, you probably know about it. They wrote about you being apologist to Central Asian regimes, and I want to ask you like a personal question about this. Is you basically devote very big chunk of your life in terms of studying this region, and very sincerely you did research, like you went to Turkmenistan, for example, and so on and so forth. And I understand that in Central Asia you have to play by certain rules, like you can't really you can't really research Turkmenistan with being a constant critic of the regime and so on. You have to do research, and then I feel like nor in Central Asia nor in the US, if you do stuff like that, people will kind of appreciate you, meaning, how can I say, Central Asians still, I think you're like American, diplomat, or you worked in the administration, or maybe there's something about you that...
Never been employed by the government.
Yeah, but like the centers are that you started is part of the government, right?
No, absolutely not.
No, okay. No. I mean the
Kennan
Soviet
Institute.
Yeah.
No, it's not governmental. It's part of the Wilson Center, which has its own board of trustees. It's a national memorial. It's like the Washington Monument.
Yeah. What I'm trying to say is, like in Central Asia, if you will make a case that I never was a part of the federal government, nobody's going to say, that must be right. They will still think that you are kind of.
So you're.
So you're in the, like, and neither here. Like if you say, you know, I'm not, you know, a puppet of regimes in Central Asia, nobody will say, no. Like people are pretty critical about what you write, right? So how do you reconcile it, like being, being, you know, not really sympathizing both parts of the.
What is a serious disease today that people are concerned
about? Cancer.
Cancer. Okay. Don't mean to imply a comparison here, but if I'm a scientist studying cancer, it doesn't mean I'm in love with cancer or that I'm somehow a affiliate of cancer. I want to my objective in Central Asia is not political at all. I could care less. It is to understand. And to understand, you have to have face-to-face contact. You have to understand. And that does imply explaining in the West and in the East, by the way. These are equally valid in Japan, China, you know. It often implies explaining to skeptics who just say, oh, this is all bad, that there's something there that you aren't grasping.
How do you live with this? Like, my question was more, again, personal, meaning neither here nor there, they fully believe your intentions. Like, I understand you probably as a scholar, but like most of the people, I'm sure in government buildings in Central Asia or in Caspian, they were still thinking about you as an American person, meaning American as being from the government.
Well, I think what you're saying, I've never thought of it this way, I have to tell you. But I would say this is an amazing sign of success if you're being criticized from both sides. Because simultaneously, you know, for 25 years, we've found immense support here for what we're doing in Central Asia. And for 25 years, I've formed deep friendships all over Central Asia, and I think these are entirely compatible.
Okay. Final question. 100 years from now, if historians want to write a book about you, what do you want to be remembered for? And the second question is, what do you think you will be remembered for?
Well, first, no one is really remembered.
No, meaning like as an author, as an intellectual. Do you think they will think, oh, Fred Starr, the jazz historian, or they will say Fred Starr, the Central Asian historian? Like, what do you think that gets you
I think
weight?
In different places and different times, people might overall be. I don't think there'll
like
be
a Google search. Like a Google search will come up with a musician or with a Central Asian. Like just guess. I mean, I'm not saying like you have to predict the future.
I have no idea.
So, okay, what do you want to be remembered for then? Like, what do you want to be remembered for?
I think that I have been very fortunate to have been able to pursue my interests in a lot of different areas that actually are much more related to one another than may at first appear. And that this is what a free person. I was fortunate to live in a very favorable environment and to make good use of it in several different areas. And whether it's me or someone else, that's an important message.
All right. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your time. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, I thank you. This has been fascinating and a lot of fun, too.
All right. Thanks.
Really much, much more than generous.
Well, now tonight it is a tremendous pleasure to introduce our mystery guest, who is a star. I don't really want to read the conventional bio here since most of you received it in the email, but I will tell you that As you know, Socrates' greatest achievement was knowing his own ignorance, and I've always known I was an ignorant man, but I never understood the dimensions of my ignorance until I began reading Frederick Starr's book, Lost Enlightenment, Central Asia's Golden Age from the Arab Conquest to Tamerlane. This is a staggering book that has shown me how ignorant I am. It's a treasure that I believe only a Renaissance man could have written. As he begins several millennia BC in Asia, the book is enriched with his own experience of working as an archaeologist, his knowledge of mathematics, of astronomy, of all of these fields is astounding. That makes this the work of a Renaissance man. Well, I will say a couple of conventional things, and that is the book's been translated into 13 languages, and that Dr. Starr is the founding chairman of the Central Asia Caucasus Institute and Silk Road Studies program affiliated with the Paul Nitze School at Zeiss, at Johns Hopkins University.